Now, some of you may ask, why a multimedia book instead of a regular standard paper book? Well, there's many reasons for that. First of all, it's ecological. There's no paper involved. The cost, since you don't have any printing, since you don't have to reserve space for prime space in the library, since you don't have to find collaborators internationally, well, it reduced the cost to a minimum, allowing less fortunate authors to be able to publish, which, as far as I'm concerned, is a very good thing. The other thing is that it's an ongoing process. A regular book, a paper book, is terminated, is finished as soon as it leaves the printer, not a multimedia book. For example, suppose that in 2 months from now, Dr. Paul decided that a new chapter is necessary because the international situation has evolved, or some information is completely obsolete. Well, at that time, with a paper book, it's impossible to do. But with a multimedia book, no problem. You just write the text, we take the text, reformat the book, upload it, and in no time it becomes available to all the users free of cost. It's with no charge. And at that time, you're sure to have always the updated version. So there's a lot of advantages using that multimedia system. Now, before I gave the parole to Dr. Derek Paul, I would like to read a part of his biography. You'll see he's quite a remarkable man. So allow me to read that. Derek Paul is a retired physicist who has also published in several other fields. He obtained his bachelor's degrees from Cambridge University and then worked for 3 years in industry. In 1953, he took up residence in Kingston, Ontario, teaching and doing research in atomic physics for a decade at the Royal Military College of Canada. He obtained a doctorate from Queen's University in 1958, and from 1964 to 1995, he was a professor at the University of Toronto. Now, in 1976, he became a participant in the Pugwash conferences on science and world affairs with their focus on peace issues. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 79 and the maximum tension in the Cold War greatly changed his off-duty activities, which came to include co-founding Science for Peace in 1981 and making several visits to the Soviet Union and one to East Germany, all for peace matters. In 2005, he co-founded the Global Issues Project, which grew to a committee of 11 and organized international roundtables over 7 years on crucial issues spanning forest, climate change, fresh water, food, population, no growth economy, biochar, and even peace in outer space. He's a member of two physical societies and from the International Society for Ecological Economics, Coalition au Climat Montréal, and the Canadian Association of the Club of Rome, and he now lives in Montreal. So it is now my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Derek Paul. Derek?
Thank you, Pierre. Thank you.
Jack.
Okay.
Can you hear me, Jack?
Yes, I can.
Good. So I say thank you. And, I want to greet everybody and say how delighted I am to see you here. I note that Eric Ferguson, I assume you're in the Netherlands, and I have known you by correspondence on email for a long time, and it's delightful to see your face for the first time, and welcome everybody else. My book is intended to stimulate debate. It's not the last word. Nobody knows the answers of how we are going to meet the challenge of climate change and make our civilization sustainable. But this book is comprehensive. It's short. You can read it in an evening. Its birth was in 2010, when I became convinced that the traditional economy, which we're all familiar with, placed many obstacles in the way of the challenge that faces us. But by 2016, I had a list of things that needed to change. The most important change is the change of mentality. The old mentality was to emphasize the growth of the economy, the growth of population, and there was a virtual assumption that that new technology was always good. I think this was even true in the 17th century, at the end of the 17th century. Now, most people have not adopted this change, though I think people who are interested in nature are the leaders here. And the Aboriginal people of North America were very good in the sense that I'm now emphasizing, that today the important thing is the health of the biosphere, and since we are part of it, that includes our health. I want to now move to the book itself. In chapter 6, you will find an encouraging, an optimistic chapter. It's one of the few long chapters in the book, and it explains that the biological farming has the potential, if it could be made worldwide, if it could become 100% worldwide, of sequestering all of the carbon dioxide that is emitted by our industries and our machines and so on, and our vehicles and so forth. This is tremendously encouraging, and I ask the question, is that enough? Does that solve the problem? And it clearly doesn't. There are other things we have to do. I'm going to have to leave it there and skip to the next one, which is less optimistic and very difficult. If you look at chapter 11, you will find a section on deep adaptation. And what this means is that the change that we are going to have to make to become a sustainable society is so profound that we cannot know in advance what the changes are going to be, but we're going to have to learn to adapt to whatever they are. This is going to be much easier for young people than older people, but we have to face up to it. Lastly, I want to speak to you a little bit about the 15 sectors of the economy that I saw in 2016 as needing change. And the question is, which of those 15 sectors of the economy in which set of those 15 sectors have we made progress? And I think there are 12 in which we have made some progress, but not nearly enough. In most of those 12 sectors, we have to go very much further than we have already come, but we're at least at the beginning. Then there are 3 sectors in which I see no progress at all. And this is so important, I want to tell you what they are. The first is reducing militarism. Luckily, there are thousands of people, and several are at this meeting, working on this, trying to reduce the evils of militarism and get a certain measure of disarmament going. Second, there's inequalities. Now, there are at least 4 books on the subject of the evils of inequalities in income, the huge gap that exists and which is constantly increasing between the richest and the poorest in our society. And none of the authors has really a clue, including a Nobel Prize winner, as to what to do about it. But they say it's important to do something. My book in chapter 19 has a clue. It gives you a clue as to where we must start. It's not easy. It requires a great deal of international cooperation, but we can make a start. The third and last of these sectors where we've made no progress at all is reforming the advertising industry. And I would say that almost nobody has recognized that a reform of the advertising industry is necessary if you want to overcome consumerism, which is one of the problems that we have had this last 40 or 50 years that has made us so extravagant and wasteful. And my closing remarks about advertising is that nobody seems to know what to do about it. And worse than that, nobody is even discussing it. So I would challenge all of you to be the first people to think about it and start the discussion going, because it's one area where I see absolutely zero progress and zero people working on this issue. And with that, I would like to conclude and move into the questions, give you people a chance to make your opinions known. And thank you.
Thank you, Derek. One thing, I'd like to add a personal comment. Before opening the questions, why do I decide to publish? Just a second. Can you close your mic? Derek, can you close your microphone? Okay, good enough. You hear me now? Okay, so I'd like to add a personal comment on my own. Why do I decide to publish that book? Well, for many reasons. First of all, in the previous life, I have worked for Environment Canada for 36 years, 20 of them as a meteorologist and 16 as a senior communication advisor. So there's one thing, I'm quite familiar with the climate change file. And I also believe that climate change and global warming are probably the maximum threat humanity has ever faced. So this is one of the reasons. The other one is because I share the ideas put forward by Derek. Maybe not all, but I share most of them. And the last one, and as far as I'm concerned, is the greatest one, because I'm convinced, really convinced that this book will start a process, will be at the origin of a complete re-examination on how and why we do things. So this is why I get into that adventure with Derek. So I hope a lot of people will do the same. So now I'm leaving the floor to questions.
Ça va.
Any questions?
We're all thinking.
You got a lot to think. 240 pages.
While you're thinking, I'll show you what the second edition looked like, and here it is. So it looks completely different from the book that Jacques and Marc-André are about to publish. And there are still a few copies of this one. But the first, yes.
Eric and Jacques, this is Julia Morton-Marr in Mississauga, Ontario, and I've been part of the Global Issues Project with Adele and many others with Derek. Derek, I've bought your new book. I have had a look through it. I am absolutely impressed with the way that Jacques has put in little clips of you speaking. And he's got photographs in there that make a lot more sense and bring the quality of the whole production. It's a production now, and it's interesting, and I love it, and I'm longing to get through and read it all. Question: where did you find Jacques?
Jacques found me, and there was a link. We are both close friends of a friend of Lilia's, and she put us in touch with each other. So we owe a great debt to her. And indeed, she gets free copies of all my books now.
Very good. Derek, as at your suggestion, I did contact CIPRI. And one of the things that came out of that security conference in 2020 was that they had several what they called post-pandemics or poly-pandemics. And you've only mentioned one of them. Did you, by any chance, did I send you a copy of the summary paper?
No, you didn't, but I was a participant many, many years ago at a CIPRI conference, and
Yes.
they're usually very good.
Oh, it was excellent.
Yes.
It's just that there's so much more now because of, I'm just looking for my copy. Oh, well, wait, I'll send it to you. I'm just curious as to how we're going to cope with all of the things from the current pandemic and all these extra things that have got worse and worse, such as your comment on the inequality between the income of various people.
Yes.
But the other thing we have, did you mention in there anything about the fact that the UN, where each country is a member because of the economic system of gross national product? Now, have you in your book attempted to change that? Because if it doesn't change at the top, all those countries that are producing the consumerism, and we have so many dollar stores where you can get things for $1, $2, and now it's got to this. I'm losing myself a little bit in the morning, but the fact that it's not only climate change, the consumerism, the plastics, the food security, as this planet is heating up, unless you are in a place where you have water, and water is drying up in South Australia very rapidly.
Yes.
As I've told you before. And the US are already in dire straits in the food section. We're getting food in Canada here from all over the world, and not necessarily United States or even in Canada. I mean, I expect it in Canada, but how many people are using hydroponics, for instance? Back to you.
That's not one question, that's very, very many questions.
I know.
I don't know where to begin, but I think that we have to take these things, at least in our minds, one at a time. Let me start with your comment on plastics. In my book, somewhere there is a comment in one of the industrial chapters. There's a comment on the use of plastics. There's no question that in North America, the use of plastics is excessive. And there's a book on this very subject, and I cite it in my book. And I also cite the recommendations of the author. It's extremely brief, it's one sentence, but he thinks plastics should be excluded from a lot of areas where we use plastics today in our own lives, in our houses. And it can be summarized in a single sentence. So if you look up my book, I'm sorry, I can't tell you which chapter it is off the top of my head, but it's one of the ones that deals with industrial excesses. I think this business of not overproducing is very serious. I think it has reached the stage where government interference is necessary. And alas, governments are behind. I think with the exception of a few governments like the Danish government and the German government, perhaps the Norwegian government, most governments are trailing rather than leading, and it's social movements that are causing the changes. I want to tell you a story, because this is a very encouraging story, and I think people like good news. I was so depressed in the last few weeks only about the situation of governments not knowing what to do about climate change and not knowing what to do about the pandemic. They seem to be completely incompetent in science, that I wrote to the president of the Royal Society of Canada. And I said, I begged him, is there something the Royal Society could do to bring some science into decision making? And he responded about 8 days later with one of the most wonderful letters, it makes me cry to think of it, that I've ever received. He said he was thinking the same things a year ago, and he has launched a number of campaigns involving 350 senior scientists and intellectuals and experts and engineers and so forth in Canada. And they have published in prominent places so much in this past year that they are already starting to get government attention. Government departments and ministers are calling them and writing to them and asking for advice. This is the most encouraging thing I've heard of in the last year. And that's what was needed. And by golly, we had a president of the Royal Society. His name is Jeremy McNeill, who was willing to do it, and who even had the goodness and the time to respond to my rather long letter. But that shows that we can do things if we act in the right way. And Jeremy, thank God he was elected president, because not every president, and I've known a lot of the presidents of the Royal Society during my long life, but not all of them would have done that. But he did. He knew how to do it. He knew whom to contact, and he acted. And it has already made a difference. And I think that's fantastic news. What other parts of your question have I not answered?
Well, the main thing is we really need to do something about re-educating all the governments.
Yes, and that was what my letter was about. What do we do about the fact that there is essentially zero science to a first approximation in government? And I think it needs a complete change in the style of government. And in fact, I'm planning to write about that because I've finished this book now, so I need something to do. And that's one of the things. I think we need a system of government where important decisions cannot be made without reference to people who know the facts and what needs to be done. And all the scientists I know in Quebec, and I don't know very many, are in agreement with me. And Normand Mousseau is the most celebrated of them. And I noticed, I don't know if he's here, but he put his name down for this event. And so I was hoping to see him. I see Eric Ferguson's hand up. Eric.
Thank you.
Adele too.
I think we all agree on the world problematique, which we've been talking about in science for about 30 years. Yeah. We no longer have to define the problems. We have to look at solutions. But I see a lot of misunderstanding, exactly as Derek says, about what the issue is. Take the climate issue. The general tendency in this country, in the Netherlands, is to talk about we should reduce energy consumption. That is a false conclusion. We do not need to economize energy anywhere in the world. There's plenty of it. If you look at solar power, you can produce that on valueless land with high temperatures and a lot of sun and a few clouds anywhere in the world. If you look at the total amount of desert area in the world and were to put solar cells on that, we would produce about 20 times as much energy as the world is now consuming. And we're doing it that inefficiently. It's not energy, it is carbon, which is the issue. And so by wrongly defining the problem as energy economy, lots of investments are being made here to try and reduce energy consumption, when the question should be, how do we harvest energy, for instance, in the Sahara, and transport it to the cloudy, cool, and not very sunny Western Europe? And so the whole problem is falsely put. The same was the question about the plastics. Plastics are a wonderful invention, excellent, high quality products, very little resource use, and they are extremely efficient and about the best thing you can do. There's one issue, it becomes waste, and the waste is a problem, not the plastic itself. So the issue should be either we use it and manage the waste together, or we don't use it at all. And then people say, but they're using carbon. They're all products of the oil industry. Yes, that's true. But it's only about 10% of the total throughput. And so what's the problem? We're using a lot of carbon products for other purposes. So if we use 10% for plastics, well, if we're not taking it out of the ground, we could use artificial hydrocarbons as a raw resource for the plastics. But don't make a plastics discussion. I see a huge effort made in this country about plastic waste. My answer is, if you collect it, just burn it. Like any other hydrocarbon, it's been in storage for a time in some piece of equipment. And the waste, you burn it. And of course, you've got to get rid of the chlorine, which is in some plastics, and not exhaust that into the air. And I see that all over the management of ecological systems, that people are paying too much attention to wrong generalizations of the problem.
Thank you very much, Eric. I don't have any response to that. Does anyone want to comment on it?
There's Adele Buckley.
Adele.
Yeah, well,
And after that,
that's really
Julia.
the question. I think Howard has a question. He'll go first. And I have another one.
Hi, Derek. It's Howard Buckley with my mom, Adele, here. And
Welcome, Howard.
Nice to see you again. It's been a
Yeah.
while.
Yeah.
So I think your topic is really interesting, and I agree with your idea of sort of a zero consumption economy. But my question is, how do you see the economy transitioning to this new model that you're proposing, in terms of, you know, people buying into the idea and adopting it on a large enough scale to make it actually happen?
I can answer that partly with great ease, and in fact, it's in the book. There's a chapter on full employment. If you want to transition from a carbon economy to one that is not a carbon economy, you are going to cause a huge amount of unemployment in what is today the petroleum and the coal industries. And what you have to do to prevent social unrest and huge dissatisfaction, what you have to do is to make sure that you have employment jobs, even if they're only temporary, that you can offer to the people who are made unemployed, rendered unemployed. And so I think full employment is a #1 issue, and it's furthermore the opposite of full employment is what we have now, and it has always been unsatisfactory because in the traditional system, in the traditional system, whenever there's a decline in the temporary, in the prosperity, the unemployment goes from something like 6 or 7% up to 20 or 30%, and it's terrible for the people who are unemployed. The question of jobs has been studied by people who are in whose discipline, scholars who are in the quality of life studies, and it's known that quality of life depends very strongly on assurance of employment. So my #1 proposal is full employment. Now, if you have full employment, you then have to have programs ready, which are not yet launched, but which you can launch as soon as you have people to put into those programs. And this is where government comes in, because you have to have programs which you are prepared to finance. And our government has shown that it has nothing. And this is, I think, not in the book, but let me tell you what I mean. When the COVID pandemic was actually a very useful test for our future, because it was obvious that a lot of people would become unemployed if you prevent shops from opening, for example, and if you make people stay at home. And so that actually happened. Then suddenly the government of Canada, since I live here, it's the only government I really know what they are doing and not doing, they decided, and they actually generated $58 billion out of thin air, which they were very able to do. And I'll tell you why this was important. But they generated this money to hand out to the people who'd lost their employment or lost their businesses and so on. Very good. But if they had had some programs of the kind I'm talking about, they could have given them alternative employment. And this is where they failed completely. So they both succeeded in providing money for these people, but they failed to give them employment, and it's very important employment. One of my recommendations in my book is that by the year 2040, 70% of the farms should be organic. And to achieve that, you have to give jobs, you have to create a lot of new jobs. That is just one example only of where you can, so you need people in government who can foresee this, who can set up programs to increase, to do research or development or installation of renewable energy, and to have these programs ready to go. And so when people are kicked out of jobs, you can offer them jobs in, you may have to offer them some retraining also. So you have to prepare for the retraining and the jobs in these other industries. It's a lot of planning, none of which has been done. And it can only be done by government, because it's only government that can go to the Bank of Canada and say, we want $58 billion. Does that partly answer your question?
Yes, it does. So I take your point that, you know, people have to be employed and have something to do to, you know, feel good about their lives in general, and this new economy, whatever shape it takes. I guess I have a follow-up question. If it's a no-growth economy and people need jobs, do you see this having a connection to productivity? So maybe productivity going down so that more people have things to do and we're not trying to continually grow all the time.
Yeah. The question about productivity is a very good one. As you know, I'm a physicist, not an economist, but I have read a lot in economics, and I don't think that the definitions of productivity that economists use are rigorous. I think they're inadequate, and I think that your question is good, but that I think that we need to redefine productivity, and I think we will get increased productivity in the long term, perhaps not very quickly, by achieving more in shorter working hours. So I think that if we are successful in the transition to zero emissions, I think what will happen is that after about 40 years from now, people will be working very hard, but for shorter hours. And so that during those shorter hours, the productivity will be very high, but people will have more free time.
I think everybody could agree, get on board with that.
The idea of shorter working hours is not new. My father had an uncle who wrote a book about shorter working hours in 1918. And the book is called The 6-Hour Day and Other Industrial Questions. And he wrote that book. He started writing that book, I think, when the working day was 9 or 10 hours. And he claims in this book that he could, by increasing productivity, pay the same wages to people who he was paying wages to for a long working day, for a 6-hour day, and make more profit. And he published this book in 1918. So I get some of my ideas from him.
But if you say that,
may I respond to that, Derek?
Yes.
I mean, this idea of having shorter days, working hours, and so forth is not new at all. But in fact, generally the contrary happens. The more efficient we become at completing jobs or doing certain tasks, then new jobs, we make up new busy work to do new things. So it will never work that way. But aside from that, Derek, I'm sorry I missed the beginning of your talk, but due to technical, couldn't get into the meeting. Yes. But towards the end of your presentation, you mentioned advertising. And I wanted to respond to that to say that the quote advertising world situation must be completely different today, because now people do everything online. Netflix had this program called The Social Dilemma, but the big corporations like Google and Apple, what people see on their smartphones is tailored and pushing them to do certain types of things and buy certain kinds of things. So I just wanted to say that with regards to advertising, the landscape has changed in the modern world, and that would have to be taken into account. The other thing is I wonder about the participation of youth in our current dilemma. And we have Greta Thunberg, who's doing a wonderful thing. I don't know if do you have any sense of how you can get the youth of today, how involved are they or not in terms of changing our economic ways of living? I don't know. Do you have any comments to make about that?
Well, that's a lot of questions, David. And by the way, for those who don't know, that was David Hunter, who has worked in my lab some 40 years ago, and he's now become an expert in physics and cosmology. And welcome, David. That's a lot of questions. With regard to the employment, of course, if you have a very short working day, there will be people who are desperately in debt or something who will take a second job and they will work harder. But I think the basic concept is that in the sort of future world that I can envisage, where there's a lot of automation, it will be possible for people to at least to earn a living in a 5-hour working day. And so now I come to your second question, which was on the advertising landscape. I agree heartily that the advertising landscape has changed, but the underlying psychology hasn't, and it's very subtle. And I think advertising today is doing a lot of harm. It's doing a lot of harm because it enters into our private lives where we should have freedom from advertising. And secondly, it's still urging us to be extravagant. And I saw a very recent example of a half-ton truck, and it doesn't matter which company it was, that was advertised, and the advertiser was saying with glowing charm, it has a 5.7 liter engine. I'm sorry, David, nobody today needs a 5.7 liter engine unless they want to go 170 miles an hour on a highway with a speed limit of 170 kilometers per hour on a highway with a speed limit of 100. You don't need that kind of waste. And I think the automobile industry, it's always if I could go back a step, it's always the petroleum and the coal industries that are blamed for the dilemma, but they are not alone. The automobile industry has encouraged extravagance every step of the way. They have designed more and more efficient engines, and all of the extra energy that you get for nothing in these more efficient engines has been used to increase the level of luxury. And this is something which is very hard to argue against, but it's also totally improper to argue for it because it's against the direction we have to go in. What was your last thing? Oh, about youth. Oh, yes, I have a great answer there. Let's just take an example. My first full year in Canada was 1954, and it was a glorious time in Canadian history because it was the most optimistic period in all of Canadian history. Everything looked good. Everything was improving. We had the Avro Arrow, the aircraft being designed by Avro, which was the first aircraft in the world that could go twice the speed of sound. And we had the Chalk River laboratories, which were designing the first nuclear reactors that wouldn't require uranium separation. So you could avoid uranium separation, of course. Separating uranium-235 and 238 is the way to make bombs. So Canada was going to do a great thing and build a nuclear reactor from which you couldn't make bombs. People have argued the other way since then, but that was the background. So everybody was very proud of being Canadian, and the history looked, the future of Canada looked very, very good. It never looked better. Now, at that time, most university students could get well-paying summer jobs, and a lot of university students could earn enough in the summer to pay all their expenses, university fees, and their living expenses for the entire next winter. A few years later, that became impossible, and it's that wonderful situation has never been regained. I think we can regain that situation because there will be jobs required on farms that are becoming organic. That's just one example, but there'll be many, many, many interesting jobs that will need to be done, and the students will get very good experience and they'll get good pay.
We have another question from Mr. Robert Hoffman.
Never mind. Okay.
Yes, thank you. First of all, greetings, Derek.
Hello.
And congratulations on your book and all of the efforts that you have put into it thus far. I guess my comment question is that you are addressing in this book a whole nexus of interrelated problems. In these days, these are called wicked problems. And what underlies wicked problems are complex adaptive systems. And I would make the point, I think, that the human mind is not well adapted to understand complex adaptive systems.
Right.
The human mind has marvelously well evolved so that we can learn and navigate in relatively short distances and relatively short time. We can understand the cause-effect relationships if they're not too distant in space and time. But of course, our dilemmas are because the cause-effect relationships for wicked problems are dispersed over space and over much longer periods of time. Some time ago, a French philosopher, polymath by the name of Joel de Rosenay, called for the development of a tool, if you like, called the macroscope. Just as a telescope is something that lets us understand things that are very distant, and a microscope lets us understand things that are very small, he argues that a macroscope is needed to understand things that are very complex. As a complement to the human mind. So just like a shovel is a complement to a human's ability to do work, a macroscope would be a complement to the human mind to help us understand these complex adaptive systems. What do you think of these ideas? And are there any possibilities? It seems to me that unless we can come together to understand some of these complex issues and the need for learning and adaptation that you've stressed, we're not going to be able to resolve these wicked problems which now threaten the very survival of our species.
That's a wonderful question, Robert. And for those people present who don't know Robert, Robert is an economist, and he has developed several very important mathematical models. And these are mentioned in my book. And all credit to you, Robert. I think, Robert, that you would be a key person to be a member of a new committee to think about could one model a macroscope? Can you personally? In fact, I'm turning it into a question. Can you personally imagine a body of modelers and philosophers and people who think as you do, who could produce a program that would say, no, don't do that now, but do this first and then try that, that would work as a macroscope? Because you've actually outlined a problem that I had not been able to put words to, but it struck me many times when I was writing this book that somehow I didn't know. I knew what should happen first and what should happen later in a vague way, but I didn't know how to actually make it happen, and in a way that would be productive. And so I think you've absolutely hit the nail on the head of what we don't know how to do. And I thank you. That's a really excellent question, because as of now, we don't have an answer. And I think you implicitly were saying that.
Anybody who was interested in this topic, Robert and Derek, should have a look at the global modeling efforts of IASA, the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis. And that was somewhere in the 1970s, I think. And I have one of the books here in my room. Global modeling. It went on for quite a way to try and do exactly what Robert was saying, having a tool to look at these complex issues. And finally, they closed off the project, but there are some very good books on it.
If I may respond briefly, the dilemma is that we can't build models of systems whose structure we cannot predict. And most efforts at mathematical modeling presume that the world is in some sense understandable in terms of the starting conditions for this set of dynamical equations. And that's the dilemma. And it seems to me we have to give up on the notion that there can be complete models. The best we can do is build things that help us understand and accumulate and are capable of accumulating new learning as it occurs. And hence the emphasis on adaptability. So we interact with the tool. The tool doesn't tell us what to do or what the future is going to be. The tool just helps us pose the right questions and accumulate understanding.
Yeah,
I would say that any macroscope which you suggest would in some way always be a model. It has to include facts from reality, but as in the same way as you just explained yourself now, it's still a model.
Yeah. Yes. I would like to make a comment on that. Can you hear me? Oh, good. Okay. I think one of the things that Robert said was that the structures, the structure of the future is unpredictable, and there is a relatively new discipline now which exists, which was founded to help industries, and that is, it's called foresight, FORESIGHT, and the foresight process is a process in which you choose a structure that you would like to have in the future, and then you see if you can create a path backwards from the future to where you are now. And if you cannot, then you go back and you try and envisage something new, which is also acceptable to you, where you can find a path from the future back to the present. I have only once taken part in that sort of process, and it was a beginning effort for all those present. It wasn't very successful, but it has been, the foresight process has been used successfully. And I think that maybe a combination of foresight to choose the structures and then the modeling to see if it could be done, if you could model for that structure. And I'm wondering, Robert, if you think that's a possible way forward, or if it's just pie in the sky.
I certainly think it's an avenue that is not only worth exploring, but it's a kind of an avenue that I've been thinking about for years and years. I might add here that I'm now engaged in a project for Canada. We have an energy systems model for Canada that's very physically and technologically oriented. And the objective is the project is to find pathways that involve the physical restructuring of the processes of the Canadian economy in such a way that greenhouse gas emissions targets are met. And this is an exercise that has never been done in this country. And the preliminary results are that reaching net zero requires much more fundamental physical transformation than anybody is talking about, not only in this country, but in most others. Essentially, they've relied on economic models that are not physically coherent to make predictions about what kinds of incentive structures, if you like, or behavioral changes might lead to reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. But of course, we can't say anything about future behavior that's 20 or 30 or 50 years out.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Robert. I have a question here from Pierre Jasmin.
Well, could you answer my question?
Oh, sorry.
First, because it
Yeah.
follows on properly from what Robert was just saying. It appears the government of Canada is attempting to improve things. So supposing that, I mean, what are you doing to bring to their attention what your ideas are? That's one part of the question, because it's no good to have us who are probably the converted to be interested. You really need to have someone with decision-making capability to deal with it.
Yes.
And then supposing that Canada went all out and adopted your new system, and all the rest of the world didn't, what would happen? Would it work at all?
I think you've just described a non-working system. I think if Canada could solve these extremely difficult problems, there would be very many other countries that would want to follow suit. But at the moment, I see Canada as a laggard, not as avant-garde. And if we could become an avant-garde, that would be wonderful. With regard to what I personally can do, I found that solo efforts, I've done some writing, especially to the Quebec government recently, and I found that doing it on my own doesn't work. I think if you're backed up by the Royal Society of Canada, for example, it helps a great deal. I think the publication of this book may help. It may help. It may get. I'm not a person who is widely known in Canada. I'm known to a lot of people, but my name is very, very far from being a household name, and so that I think for the moment I will probably furnish ideas to the Royal Society rather than to governments, although I do plan to write to the federal government on one point. There's no guarantee that you get a reply, but I'm very careful about how I do those things. I don't send letters that are quickly written and hastily written. I don't think that answer will satisfy you, but it's the best I can say right now.
Well, in an ideal world, it would be better if every member of parliament, including, of course, the ministers, were to have a copy of your book. They might actually look at it. But anyway, I don't suppose that's really feasible.
It is feasible, but they don't want it. I offered Pierre Elliott, Justin Trudeau, a copy of this, and he said with regret that he was unable to accept it. And I don't know the reason, but I think it was because he had very conventional economic advisors. And it's something I haven't had the opportunity to say, but I had planned to say today that one of the problems that faces the world that does need to mention is that today, almost everybody who receives a good education, a thorough education in economics, is being educated in the traditional economy. And this is why the considerable number now of ecological economists who are thinking in a new way, that what they are doing, instead of publishing books like mine, they occasionally publish a book, but mostly what they are doing is to educate a new generation in ecological economics, so that when there is a position open for a university teacher in economics, one of these people will likely get the post or has a chance of getting the post. And today, for example, for the first time, I noticed that there's a vacancy at York University for an ecological economist. I was in contact with another department head recently in economics, and that was at Trent University. And I casually asked how many ecological economists they have on their staff, and the answer was 0. So when you have 0 and you need 100%, you've a long way to go. And may I answer Pierre Jasmin's question now? I'm sorry, Pierre, mes excuses pour avoir retardé. You say, is there any mention, Derek, in your new book about Keynesian economics philosophy, which fits perfectly with the proposal to have a short working day, a 4-hour working day, because it would leave more time for reading and enjoying the arts? Yes, it does. But there's no mention in my book of the Keynesian philosophy. Perhaps I wasn't really sufficiently aware of it to mention it, but forgive me because I tried to make my book as concise as possible. And Mark Andre here is a witness to that. It caused him a lot of trouble when he had to eliminate things that he'd already put in. I have another question. Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, I've answered your question, Adele. Yes. Okay, I think that's all the questions that I've received on the written list here.
Yes.
Okay, is there any other questions? Okay, so it's more than an hour now. So I'll close the meeting right now. And on behalf of Dr. Paul and our team, I would like to thank you for attending that meeting. Now, we'll keep you posted because in the nearby future, we have some ideas. And one of these ideas is to build a YouTube channel dedicated to the work of Mr. Paul. So when it's going to be available, you all will be contacted, because as far as I'm concerned, there's a lot of things we couldn't do on that thing. Interviews, talks, and everything that we can't put into a book because it's too heavy. But as far as I'm concerned, maybe over the next 2 or 3 months from now, you will hear from us again. And this time it will be for a YouTube channel dedicated to Mr. Paul. So on this, I want to thank you all, and I wish you a very good day. See you, folks.